Okay, so if you've been with us, you know we've been kind of tracking the progress of what's been happening. First Samuel starts kind of at the end of what I call bad Israel, where Israel's being bad, right? We went through the book of Judges where we watched Israel go from being this good nation, slowly corrupting itself, and eventually ending where we pick up kind of at the beginning of 1 Samuel, where they just completely gave in to everything, all the surrounding cultures. They allowed their surrounding gods to come into their lives, and they began to get into idolatry, and things got really, really bad for them, so much so that they began to think that they could manipulate God, and somehow they had some sort of power over God. Why? Because, well, the foreigners, they have powers over their gods. If they do these things, they can make their gods do things. So surely we could do the same thing. And then, of course, God shows up. He shows his power, first he doesn't show up to show them, no, you can't make me do what you want me to do. And then he shows up to the Philistines to say, and by the way, I don't need them. I am God. I don't need these people. And so the ark of God has made it back into the land of Israel, and people are beginning to rejoice. But however, 70 people died because they violated the sanctity of the ark. This is important just because it starts here in verse 1. So the men of Kiriath-Jearim came and took the ark to the Lord. If you remember at the very end of chapter 6, it said the men of, oh my goodness, I had it wrote down and now I forget. This is the beauty of editing, is I can go back and make myself sound like I had this all memorized. Beth Shemesh. So the men of Beth Shemesh had sent for the men over at Kiriath-Jearim because they were terrified of, by the way, I did have it written down. I see it now, and now I feel like a fool. The men of Beth Shemesh had sent for them because they were scared of God, right? God showed up and judged them for their violation of the ark. And so these men came and they took it, and it says they brought it, the ark, to Abinadab's house on the hill, and they consecrated Eleazar, his son, to guard the ark of the Lord. So you're immediately seeing, right, there's beginning to be a change of heart immediately in the land of Israel, in the hearts of the Israelites. Right? They're finally starting to recognize, who God is and his power. Right? They're starting to recognize that there is something sacred here. And it says the ark remained at Kiriath-Jearim for a long time, 20 years in all. It will remain there until a certain special king is going to request it be brought. Then it says, then all the people of Israel turned back to the Lord. Turned back. We have a special word we use here when we talk about this. We call it repentance. Where we turn and we go against the things of the world. For this is actually an amazing, joyous, cause for jubilee time. This is the first time since the days of Joshua, where the nation of Israel has begun to turn back, repent of its sin, and begun to serve the Lord as a nation. This is an incredible moment. We're actually being able to go back. It's like, this is a cool thing about books, especially historical books, is we're able to go back in time and witness events as they happen, as they unfold. And we're now being able to see the beginning of the golden age of Israel. And it happened all right here when they turned back to the Lord. And it says, so Samuel said to all the Israelites, remember Samuel, or Eli and Eli's sons are all dead now. Right? Judgment of the Lord came. So now there's only Eli. Eli is now basically the high priest, the prophet, the judge. And so he says to all the Israelites, if, I love this, if always highlights a condition, right? Okay. If you are returning to the Lord with your heart, with all of your hearts, then rid yourselves of foreign gods, the Asherahs, and commit yourself to the Lord and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hand of the Philistines. The reason I love this particular phrase is there has been an argument, a chicken-egg argument, since the beginning of Christianity. I've brought it up before. It's why the book of James was actually quite controversial, and there's actually been different groups that have actually tried to get the book of James removed from the Bible because they say, no, it's about you do these works and you get grace, and it's, of course, right, so what comes first, works or grace? But I think this very clearly, all the way back in the Old Testament, before the golden age of Israel, in 1 Samuel, we read that if, being the beginning, the first thing, you turn your heart to the Lord, if you're returning to God, if you've decided you're going to commit your heart to God, you're going to live for Him, serve Him, do the things that He's asked you, live the way that He's called you to be, then you're going to see fruit come out of that. What is it going to look like? In their case, it's going to look like them getting rid of their foreign gods, getting rid of the idols, actually upholding the second commandment for once in their lives. And they're going to actually go out there and show the world, we do not serve these other things because we are 100% committed to God. Is their 100% commitment to God the thing that's saving them? No. It was the fact that they had accepted God. And then we began to see the fruit in their life. Even in the Old Testament, we saw this same recipe, the same design was set out all the way back then. This wasn't brand new at the time of Jesus, right? Jesus died once for all, including them, because it was one design that God had, that He had set up since the beginning. Right? At this time, you can also remember that Israel had been oppressed by the Philistines since the days of Shagmar. And if you're forgetting, who on earth is Shagmar? Remember, he was that very quick judge that was mentioned very early in the book of Judges, where it basically said, hey, there was this guy named Shagmar. He used an ox goad, and he killed like 500 Philistines. Like, that's basically his whole story. But since those days, the Philistines have been a thorn in the side of Israel. And it says, so he gives them their challenge, and he says, look, if this is real, if what you're saying is you really are committing yourselves to God, I will know it's real if you do these things. And so in verse 4 it says, the Israelites put away their Baals and their Asherahs and served the Lord only. They finally removed the idols and said, no, there will be nothing between us and God. We will serve the Lord and the Lord alone. So then Samuel said, assemble at Mizpah, and I will intercede with the Lord for you. And when they had assembled at Mizpah, they drew water and poured it out before the Lord. And on that day they fasted, and there they confessed, we have sinned against the Lord. And now Samuel was serving as the leader, or the judge, depending on your translation, of Israel at Mizpah. Now we're about to go to another strange part of the story. Starts in verse 7. And I want to remind you of Moses and the Egyptians. See, when Moses came before Pharaoh and he said, let my people go, right? He did so on behalf of God. He said, the Lord God says, let my people go. He wasn't saying, out of Moses' authority, he was saying out of the authority of God. And it took the 10 plagues of Egypt before Pharaoh finally let them go. I want you to compare that to what's happening in this story. Here we once again see the Philistines are oppressing the people of God. To their own detriment, of course, the Israelites, of course, doing things that are causing things to themselves. But once again, God has become a captive in an enemy nation and shows His power. So much so that they finally release Him and send Him on His way. Right? So far, it's looking very similar, and it only gets more similar starting right now, which is, if you remember the ending of that story, not only did Israel leave, but then Egypt went, wait a minute, we just sent our whole workforce out. Who's going to do the work? We need to go get them. And so they immediately charged out, totally forgetting the power of God that was just exercised on them. Right? This is another reason why I often say to people, no, a miracle would not change your mind. People will, I'm sure many of you have even thought that yourselves, or you've certainly heard people say it. They say, if only God would do such and such a thing, if only God would perform this miracle, then I would believe. And I say, no, you wouldn't. Because if the evidence that is already presented before you isn't enough, then it doesn't matter what happens. These people, right, in Egypt, we saw it where the 10 plagues of Egypt came upon them, including the angel of death. And they still were not convinced of the power of God and still went out to try and capture the people of Israel again. And here we'll read, starting in verse 7, when the Philistines heard that the Israel had assembled at Mizpah, the rulers of the Philistines came up to attack them. They had just gone through this 7 months of torment of God's power and judgment coming against them, to the point where they went, there is only one thing to do. We need to get their God out of here. He is too difficult for us. And how quickly we forget, because again, it didn't matter the miraculous showings of power that God had showed them there. They were not convinced of his might and power. Right? Faith does not come by miracles. Faith is trust. And it blows me away that just like the Egyptians before them, they had just settled their score with God. They had just gone through all of this, and how quickly they forget. Oh, how quickly and naively they go, wait a minute, no, we're more powerful than them. We can overcome. So when the Israelites heard, they were afraid because of the Philistines. And I think that's totally appropriate. When you got an army outside of your door, whether you worship God or not, that's a scary notion, isn't it? Right? The entire nation of Israel had gathered together. They were worshiping the Lord. They were grateful, and their hearts were turning, and they were coming back to a genuine worship of God. Things were finally becoming good. And then suddenly, when things finally look like they're getting better, the enemy shows up and wants to conquer them. Now it's different. This is where the stories begin to diverge. See, in Moses' situation, remember the people cried out, "You've brought us out to die, that we would be killed out here." In this case, the people have a change of heart, and they said to Samuel, "Do not stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, that he may rescue us from the hand of the Philistines." They had faith. Devastation, doom lay on the horizon. They saw the army coming towards them. Remember, this is a group gathered for worship. They're not prepared for war. They're not prepared for battle. What are they going to do? So instead, they seek God. This is an amazing turn. It's an amazing change of heart that we're seeing here, and we're going to see the amazing act of God, because when God makes a promise, when God says something, he will hold true to it. And it says here, so then Samuel took a suckling lamb, sacrifices a whole burnt offering to the Lord. He cried out to the Lord on Israel's behalf, and the Lord answered him. Now I want to ask you, do you think that night when the angel of death swept through Egypt and saw the blood on the doorpost, do you think there was some sort of aversion to the angel of death? Do you think the angel of death went, "Oh, blood, I have to stay away from that"? No, right? Like, that seems pretty foolish. So then what did the blood do? The blood wasn't, right? There was no magical, mystical thing. There was no ritual thing that kept the angel of death away from those people. It was the act of faith. It was saying, the Lord has asked me to do this thing. And guess what? Does that make a whole lot of sense to you? Oh, if I want to protect myself, I need to put blood on my doorpost? How does that protect me? That's not the point. The point was God asked them to do something, and as an act of faith, an act of trust, they said, "You know what, God? Maybe I don't understand. Maybe this doesn't quite make sense to me, but I'm going to trust in you. I've put my faith in you, and I'm going to do as you asked." And so here we see Samuel at the same time. Do you think there was anything magical or mystical that was happening with the sacrifice of this lamb? No. But it was an act of faith saying, "You know what, God? We trust you. And these are the things that you've asked of us, so guess what? We're going to do it, and we may not understand. We may not quite understand what's happening here, but guess what, God? This is what you've asked us to do, and in faith, we will respond." See, God's stance never changes, and I think it's fair to say, as I said, that the sacrifice was not mystical or had any kind of influence on changing God's mind. I think instead it was just a reflection of the heart of the people, the fruit in their lives. Right? That the chicken came before the egg. That grace comes before works. See what verse 10, while Samuel was sacrificing the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to engage Israel in battle. But that day the Lord thundered out against the Philistines and threw them into such a panic that they were routed before the Israelites, just like that of the Red Sea. Suddenly God shows his power. The men of Israel rushed out of Mizpah, pursued the Israelites, and slaughtered them all the way along to a point below Beth-kar. Then Samuel took a stone, set it up between Mizpah and Shen, and he named it Ebenezer, meaning stone of help, saying, "Thus far the Lord has helped us." And so the Philistines were subdued, and they stopped invading Israel's territory. Throughout Samuel's lifetime, the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines, and we will read about this more and more, including maybe a little shepherd boy and a monster named Goliath. The towns from Ekron to Gath, so this is a part of the Gaza Strip, were then returned to Israel. And Israel delivered the neighboring territory from the hands of the Philistines. For the first time since the Philistines arrived on their shores, Israel controlled that territory again. And there was peace between Israel and the Amorites. In case you forgot who they were their neighbors to the east, right? The rulers on the east side, who were constantly coming in through the book of Judges to pillage and raid. And suddenly they saw the power of God and what God did to the Philistines and went, enough's enough. Samuel continued as leader all the days of his life. From year to year, he went on a circuit from Bethel to Gilgal to Mizpah, judging Israel in all of those places. But he always went back to Ramah, where his home was. And there he also held court for Israel, and he built an altar there to the Lord. So how do we use this? What good? That's always the thing when I go through the Bible, and I think this is really important for us to, as an exercise when we're going through, is, okay, I've read this thing in the Bible, but, I'm not going to war today, hopefully. So how does this apply in my life? And one of the things that I immediately drew out is, even when you're right with God, right, this is important. Even when you're right with God, you may be called to very challenging times. Right? These people, right? And I'm sure there's a lot of people here that could probably relate to this. You've gone through some turmoil in your life, and suddenly you're like, you know what, God, I've got things messed up, and you turn your life around, and you're trying to make things right between you and God, and then it seems suddenly like the whole world is against you. Everything comes to attack you all at once, and you're like, God, I thought I was doing the right thing. What's going on? Although peace may have been attained with the Amorites, it seems the Philistines still didn't get the message, and they continued their assault against the people of God. But this time, God fought with them, and the Philistines were routed. The Israelites struggled with fear because their enemy was great, but they also remembered that God was greater. The sacrifice we read about shows the heart of the people and how they had returned to God as he had always intended. All that said, they were still called on to fight and overcome their enemy. They made the sacrifice. They prayed to God. They said, God, what do we ought to do? And you know what? God did turn the tables, but they still had to act, didn't they? There was still something for them to do. See, that's the thing about service to God. A lot of times we kind of want to just bring our request and just kind of lay them at the feet of God, which we need to do, but then we walk away and we say, okay, thanks God, see you later. Instead of remaining at his feet and saying, God, how can I serve you? How can I be of use? How can you use me to get through this circumstance? And that's challenging because it's scary. It requires bravery to look in the face of the great adversaries of our life, no matter what it is, and decide, you know what, God, I'm going to rally for you. See, they rallied against their fear, and they were able to secure a great victory. God set the field, but it was still up to them whether or not they wanted to use his gift or not. See, the very same thing is true for us today. We need to trust God, we need to take control, and we need to be ready when it's our turn to do what needs to be done. We need to overcome our fear of the world, and we need to recognize that if God is for us, then who could be against us? Why do we need to obey when he calls? So I've got Deuteronomy chapter 6. This is something that's interesting. People often say, well, why do we have to obey these things? Why, what's so important about the moral law? Why should we be trying to do these things? Isn't grace enough? Sure, yeah. Jesus' sacrifice is enough to save you. But Deuteronomy 6 verse 3, this promise is still true. Hear, O Israel, and be careful to obey. Now he's talking about the law that he just finished teaching them. Right? Deuteronomy is the reteaching of the law to the next generation that was about to go inherit the land of Israel. And he says, be careful to obey. Why? So that it may go well with you, and you may increase greatly in a land flowing with milk and honey, just as the Lord your God, the God of your fathers, promises you. See, a lot of times we feel like, we need to obey to avoid punishment, or to avoid, maybe even in the grander sense, to avoid hell. But that's not why we should be careful to obey, right? Jesus' grace covers the sin. But prosperity comes from following God. The tricky thing is that sometimes it's prosperity in things that we, when we first come to Jesus, don't even consider that important. It's what I talked about last week. It's getting caught up in the culture of materialism. We think prosperity means, it's more money, and it's faster cars, and it's, better shopping. I don't know what people like. But it's the material things. When instead, maybe it's a family, friends. Maybe it's a good job or a good career. Maybe it doesn't pay that well, but it's something that you love and enjoy, and your life gets full and rich. You begin to prosper, and you increase greatly. See, I put God's feelings towards us, because we have this weird thing, this weird obsession with feelings. What God feels towards us, how he wants to relate to us, is through love. But he's absolutely compelled to be just, even if he loves you. And for anyone here that has children, right, you get that. I love my daughter unconditionally. But when she violates the rules, when she breaks the rules, you have to set things right. That's what justice means. It means to bring back to rightness, right? We have to reestablish rightness. And you have to bring in correction. See, we fear the Lord because of his great power and his ability to bring justice, because it can be scary. And we talked about this last week. And he will do it even on those that he loves. It's why he showed mercy to the Philistines when they chose to do good, and then immediately turned around and punished them when they began to do evil again. We need to be careful to obey. Why? If you want all that goodness, if you want all that promise, and you're saying, where is this promise that God has given? Why am I not seeing that in my life? Well, are you careful to obey? Right? Salvation is the gift. Right? Gift is unearned. But the rest comes from a life of dedication, of trying to put on that fruit, right? It's that if-then that we just read about at the beginning. If your life is going to be dedicated to God, then I want to see these things in your life. If you've chosen to live a life for God, then it should be obvious to everyone around you, as we discussed last time. It should be perfectly clear to anyone who sees you, anyone who meets you. You go, there's something different about you, or they will know immediately you're a Christian. That's becoming less obvious in our culture today because, man, I brought up Moses at Trinity Kids, and the kids were like, who? All that to say, coming to God, there's still going to be difficult, challenging, very hard times. And this is why I said what I said last week, that we have a duty and a responsibility to each other, to help each other, because guess what? Many hands make light work. When we have challenging times ahead and we're going through difficulty, bring it to the church. And I don't mean to the building, I mean to these people. We're here to help. We're here to help lighten the burden for each other. We're here to be the people of God. So let's not slouch away from our difficult responsibilities, but instead embrace the challenges head on, because that's how we change the world.